So we've looked at how to navigate around the viewport, the perspective viewport. What we're going to have a look at now is how to actually manipulate objects within the viewport. Basically, that's going to be move, rotate, and scale. So what we're going to do first is we can select our chair object. And did we actually select that? Yeah, we got the chair selected. If you're ever unsure about whether you've selected something or not, just go to the scene outliner and see which one is actually selected. So we can select our chair. And if we have a look what happens, this gizmo immediately pops up. Now, up the top of the perspective view, you'll see there's a few little buttons just up here. And we have translate, which is basically move, rotate, which rotates our objects, and scale, which allows us to resize our objects. So we have at the moment translate selected. I'll also mention, so these buttons at the top allow us to change between these different modes. We can also use the keyboard. So W is for translate or move, E will select rotate, and R will select scale. So you can use those as quick keys anytime as well, instead of just clicking on these buttons. It's pretty handy. Now, what happens when I select an object and I have move selected up here is that this little gizmo appears down the bottom. So we haven't spoken too much about what these are, but we have in 3D space 3 axes. So we have our X, Y, and Z axis. Now, if you look down the left-hand corner here, you'll see we've also got a little sort of helper here as well. If I just rotate around a bit, you'll see that actually rotates as well. So we have our X, Y, and Z axes. Now, the important thing to remember here is that as far as colors go, X is red, Y is green, and Z is blue. That's like the RGB color set. So X, Y, Z also conforms to RGB. So if you ever forget which one it is, just try and remember that. So back to our gizmo. Our move or translate gizmo allows us obviously just to move things within our world. So we can grab one of these arrows and we can move our object within our 3D space. Now, if I use those arrows, it restricts me to that particular axis. So all I can do is move it along, in this case, the X-axis, or the Z-axis, or if I grab the Y, along the Y-axis. Now that's handy because mostly you do want to control which particular axis you move in. Now, I'm just going to hit the F button for focus, just to focus back on here, and I'm going to pull back a little bit. So that allows me to hold down the option, allows me to hold down the option key and the left-hand mouse button, and to actually rotate around that object. You'll see in the gizmo, I've got those 3 arrows, but also if actually I can't really get closer because it just gets smaller, but you'll notice what I have as well are these little squares in between each axis. Now that allows me to move the object on that plane. So I can actually move along 2 axes, but it keeps one of those axes fixed. Now again, that can be quite useful because often you do want to move things along a plane or along a particular axis without changing another axis. Particularly say you've got the chair on the floor and you just want to move it around somewhere else on the floor. You don't want to change the height. You don't want to move it off the floor. So you can just use the one of those planar axes. Now the other one is you can actually grab the center. I don't really recommend using this one, and you can really move it anywhere. The problem is in the perspective viewport, it's very hard to tell exactly where you're moving things. So you can use that one, but I probably wouldn't really recommend that. And I'll just pop that down. Just a trick as well, if you want something to pop down to meet flush with the ground, you can hit the end key if you have one on your keyboard. Unfortunately, I don't have one on this computer, so I can't use it. But if you're using a computer that does have an end key, hit that and it will take your object down flush with the floor. So that's the move tool. If we have a look on the right hand side at our details, you'll also see we have a transform component here, which has a location, rotation, and scale. Now, you may not have noticed, but if I go and move my chair, you'll see that the X location is actually changing. So I can move that forward and backward, and you'll see that the values in the location are changing. So when I translate or move an object, it does change this. So I can use the transform and just punch values directly into here. So if I move that up there and I say, well, actually I want that to be exactly minus, you can see it's got quite a long decimal point there, minus 200, and hopefully we'll still be able to see that. We can do that. If I want to change that to, say, minus 150, and you can see it moving there in the perspective viewport. So if I want to be more accurate, I can just go and enter values into my transform here, and that's the same for the rotation scale as well. So let's actually, one thing I want to show you as well, if you look at the next button here in the viewport, this gives us the option of moving things in world or local coordinates. Let me just rotate around here. Now, at the moment, you'll see our chair is facing kind of off on an angle here, whereas our axis is pointing here. So I can move the chair like so along the x-axis, but what happens if I want to move it along this axis, in forwards? Well, I could go and grab this planar one, but then again, well, I'm not moving along the axis, and maybe I want to be a little bit more accurate than that. There is an easy solution, and that is to go and click on this button, which at the moment it's got a little world there, so it says world coordinates. If I click on that, it pops up to local coordinates. Okay, so what that means is that it's the coordinates that are relative to the object I have selected. So if I click that again, you'll see the difference. That's world coordinates, and because this has been rotated, the rotated coordinates, the local coordinates, are rotated in that direction. So what I can do now is that I can easily slide this along forward in relation to the actual chair. So that is quite an important one when you're moving objects around the world. So scaling, let's just go to our, sorry, not scaling, rotating. This is the rotation gizmo. You can see again we have our rotating around the x-axis, around the y-axis, and around the z-axis. So if I grab this, I can move it around, and you see that it's giving me the number of degrees that I'm actually moving it while I'm rotating it. Okay, so I might just hit Command Z there to undo that, and I can do that around the y-axis as well. Again, very similar, all the gizmos are quite similar, so I can also change the rotation in the transform as well if I wanted to. So if I wanted to say change it by 90 degrees around the x-axis, I can do that really easily. Just hit Command Z to undo that. Same with the Y and the Z. I didn't mention before, but you can actually just come into these and you can drag around that as well, which is another way to sort of dynamically do it with the mouse. Scaling as well, you also have the option, rotating as well, you also have the option to rotate around world and local coordinates. I did have local coordinates selected then. I could have been using world coordinates. Works the same way. Okay, it's up to you which one you want to use. So finally, there is scaling. So let's go and select that, or I could hit the R key. And you'll notice this time I can't select world coordinates. With scaling, you can only scale along local coordinates. Now the reason for that is that if you were allowed to scale using world coordinates, you could seriously disfigure your object. So we are limited to scaling along local coordinates. So if I do that, just grab one of these, stretch that out, make that look really cool. I can scale it up, and I can make it wider if I like. Now, same again, I can scale along, oops, the wrong one selected. Can be a little difficult finding each of these, so I can scale along. Can't really see that very well. I can scale along a plane, and it's not really, there we go. Okay, so that's scaling in two directions. And if I grab the center, I can actually scale in all directions at once, which is actually really useful for quite often you actually just want to change the size of an object. So you might want to make it twice as big. You drag it into the scene, and you find it's too big or too small. You don't want to change the actual dimensions. You just want it to be bigger or smaller. So you just grab the center one and do that. Alternatively, of course, you can come into the details section here, the transform, and you can just enter in. So say we want to make it twice as big in each of these, 2 by 2 by 2. Okay, and we've scaled it by 2 really easily. So that is moving, rotating, and scaling objects in our game world.